If you met someone on the street who introduced himself to you as a philosopher, what would you assume about him? My guess is, if you're like a lot of people I've met, you'd probably assume that he's someone who has some really weird ideas and spends all of his free time, of which there must be a lot, studying other people's really weird ideas. After all, there certainly seems to be a perception today that philosophers, almost by definition, are people who live with their heads way up there in the clouds and forget to, come down and touch grass every once in a while. That a philosopher is someone who makes a career out of thinking the most radically unique thing possible, to the point of rejecting what most people in the world would consider to be common sense. And it's that phrase, common sense, that I want to focus on here. Here's the thing. I'm not actually here to disagree with the perception that people have that philosophers can sometimes be out of touch with common sense. In fact, even though I'm a philosophy student, I actually agree that a lot of philosophers today kind of fit that bill. Instead, I'm going to suggest that being out of touch with common sense is actually something that's not supposed to be part of philosophy. That philosophy, when done right, is actually supposed to support common sense, not deny it. That's certainly how the first philosophers saw their mission. The earliest philosophers had a notion of what they called a self-evident principle, or a basic starting point which they believed that no one could deny without sacrificing his sanity. It was the job of the philosopher, they thought, to make these self-evident principles fit with each other, to create a system of understanding the world which resolved any apparent contradictions in self-evident principles without abandoning any of them. The classic example of a self-evident principle is the law of non-contradiction. This notion, which says that something cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect, can't be proven by reason. After all, any attempt to try to prove the law of non-contradiction would inevitably end up invoking the law of non-contradiction. That's how fundamental this principle is in logic. Instead, to know that the law of non-contradiction is true, one can really only appeal to the fact that we all intuitively operate as if this principle is true. If you asked me if it's hot or cold outside, and I answered both, you would know that I was trying to be funny, because obviously you can't be both hot and cold in the same place at the same time. When we think like that, we're implicitly appealing to the law of non-contradiction. Same goes if I asked you whether you like, say, hot dogs. You might qualify your answer and say that you like hot dogs cooked one way, but not another way, or that you only like hot dogs on, say, the 4th of July. But by doing that, you're only specifying certain respects in which you like hot dogs or not. Your answer ultimately comes down to a simple, non-contradictory yes or no. And you see, for the earliest philosophers, the fact that the law of non-contradiction was so universal to man's method of thinking, and the fact that it's so fundamental for our natural logical reasoning, was enough to show that it's self-evident. If you reason to a conclusion that breaks the law of non-contradiction, that means there's a problem with your reasoning, not a problem with the law of non-contradiction. And these earliest philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas argued that the other self-evident principles are arrived at in basically the same way. If there's a principle that is universally and instinctively accepted by everyone, and accepted not just because everyone says it's the case, but because our natural human ways of operating would fall apart without it, then that principle is self-evident and should be taken as a starting point in any attempt to understand the way the world works. And these would include principles like the whole is greater than its part, which we assume when we do any kind of mathematical reasoning, or good is to be done and evil is to be avoided, which can't be proved, but forms the basis of all of moral reasoning. Any moral theory out there relies on that self-evident first principle. The earliest philosophers also tended to treat notions like, there is a world outside of our sense experience, and there is such a thing as a self, or even there is such a thing as free will, as self-evident. All of these things, they argued, don't need to be proved, because we have a universal sense that they're all true, a sense that forms the basis of everything we think. According to these philosophers, no one can really deny that the world outside of himself exists, because everything about his experience tells him that it exists. No one can deny that he has free will, because whenever he acts, he's implicitly assuming that he has free will. Because we all have an experience of these things, they can't reasonably be denied. Instead, they should be taken as the starting point of any attempt to rationally understand the world. Every and any theory of the way the world works should be held to the standard of the common sense, self-evident propositions to make sure it explains them. The problem, though, is that modern philosophers have begun to use their particular favorite theories of the world as the standard by which to judge these things that were previously considered self-evident, not the other way around. Instead of saying, hey, my understanding of the world means that free will can't exist, so I guess there's something wrong with my understanding of the world, philosophers for the last few hundred years, basically since Descartes in the 17th century, have said something like, well, I guess that means there's no free will. This means that philosophy today has essentially abandoned the notion of a self-evident principle and suggested instead that everything has to be proved, and that no positions, like, say, a belief that the self exists, are to be privileged over other positions, like, say, the position that all of reality is an illusion. Looking at you, Descartes. And this, I think, is exactly why philosophers have gotten the reputation for being slightly off their rockers. Modern philosophers have untethered their systems of thought from those truths which everyone knows intuitively cannot be denied, and therefore have no qualms about denying things which every non-philosopher takes as undeniable, like the existence of the self, or of the world outside of the self, or free will, or even the law of non-contradiction, which, yes, some modern philosophers have denied. And when philosophy is no longer about defending these common sense principles that everyone shares, when the theory is considered more important than common sense, philosophical ideas start to look really strange really fast. And all of a sudden, you have the likes of Hume and Kant denying that we can learn anything from the world around us, and people like Spinoza arguing that free will is an illusion, and the likes of Hegel seeming to abandon even the law of non-contradiction itself. Those common sense things didn't fit these philosophers' preferred theories of how the world operates, so they had to be abandoned. But what's the solution? How can we stop philosophy from spiraling further and further away from common sense? I think philosophy needs to discover its role as the defender of the self-evident, remembering that a good philosophical theory is one which explains those things which are known intuitively and makes them work together in a coherent system, without abandoning any of them. We need, in other words, to reconnect with what the 20th century philosophical historian Étienne Gilson called a philosophy of common sense. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Gilson, you see, used that phrase, a philosophy of common sense, in reference to a school of philosophy which pre-existed modern philosophy, that of Aristotelian Thomism, or a school which draws from the thinking of Aristotle as understood by the Catholic philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas. Gilson, like many throughout history, thought that this school did a remarkable job at explaining the world without abandoning common sense, and was only abandoned by the early modern philosophers because they failed to understand what St. Thomas was talking about in his ideas. And I happen to agree with that line of thinking. I actually happen to think that the best way of understanding the world was actually arrived at 800 years ago, and that philosophy peaked in the Middle Ages before being turned on its head in the Renaissance. It's a radical thesis, I know, and definitely a bit unconventional. Usually we think that the Renaissance got things more right than the Middle Ages, not the other way around. But it's a thesis that I plan on defending on this channel in the next several years. Bit by bit, video by video, I plan on assembling the parts of my argument and showing how the traditional Thomist view of the world accounts for what we know about the world today without abandoning common sense like modern philosophy has. And more than that, I hope to draw out some of the implications of the Thomist view of reality. To put all my cards on the table here, I'm a religious person, and a Catholic specifically. I'm a Catholic in part because I think that things like the existence of the classical theist God or the existence of immortal human souls necessarily follow from the best attempts to understand the world in the light of common sense. To affirm both the law of non-contradiction and say the existence of the self, I would argue, forces an honest person to believe in the existence of God. Again, I know this is a radical claim. I also know that it runs contrary to most people's way of thinking about the world. But I also happen to think that it's true, and hope on this channel to share it with others, who may be convinced that being a good philosopher requires everyone to give up on common sense. It doesn't. But it might just require everyone to be a Catholic. That's the claim, anyway. That's what I'm going to try to prove. If you want to see this argument played out, you're going to have to follow the content of my channel to watch as I assemble the parts of the argument over the next few years. And if you want a good way to follow my content and help me reach more people at the same time, please subscribe to my channel. It grows the channel and lets you get notified when my videos come out. So it's really a win-win. You get notified, I get to grow. It's great. But whether you end up subscribing or not, I hope you learned something from this video. Thanks for watching, and God bless.